Good morning. I'm recording this in an empty auditorium because we have a special speaker this morning, Olivier Melnick, and during my regular update hour, I'm going to be interviewing and having a discussion with Olivier from Chosen People Ministries about anti-Semitism and some other issues. So I came in early to do prophecy updates. So today we're going to talk about multi-level warfare. Let's open with a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the promises that you've made. Thank you for the information that you have given us so that we might be able to live and stand in troublesome times. Watch over us this day. Bless Olivier as he comes to speak today. In Jesus' name, amen. So today, living multi-level warfare, we talk each week about the convergence of events that are taking place in our world. Again, every week it seems like there's something that's a little bit more troubling than the week prior. Last week I mentioned some things. Let me just get some general things out of the way. I'll talk a little bit about some things going on geopolitically, weather, that sort of thing. Then I will talk about some cultural things. Then I will talk about the Middle East and the Israeli elections. I think that's the order that I have today. So I mentioned this briefly last week. As you know, my PowerPoint was destroyed by a very incompetent person who was operating my computer. That would be myself. And I accidentally saved over my presentation, so I had to pretty much go from memory. I was able to salvage about 6 slides. But I mentioned this last week. This is just an interesting thing that's going on. This is a graphic from the New York Times about the flooding that took place throughout the Midwest, throughout the Mississippi River Basin earlier this year that's still having impacts. There are places you may or may not know, I don't think the media covers it very well, that show that, or there are many places that they still have not been able to get into fields to assess damage and that sort of thing. And this is going to have a huge impact going forward on farming to some extent this year, but next year, things I'm reading indicate that farmers will have a very, very difficult year, and many farms will fail. I know from statistics here locally in Ohio that farm bankruptcy filings have already gone up quite a bit. They're seeing more than they ever have. This is a graphic from the weather the other day. This first time they've ever had 6 named storms rotating through the Pacific and the Atlantic basins around the United States at one time. Now, one of these, somebody suggested that one of these might hit California, but the water off California is pretty cold, so I doubt that would happen. If that would happen, that would be a really big news, because I don't think California's ever been hit by a hurricane, but I think it's probably very unlikely. We did have a problem with Imelda. A friend of mine down in the Beaumont, Texas area said that at his home there in Beaumont, they got over 9 inches of rain in 1 hour. And some of the places around Houston actually got more rain this year than they did in Harvey. And in fact, in Houston, they're saying that they've now had, they talk about the 100-year flood, a flood that's of a severity that's only supposed to come about once every 100 years. But now, in the last 2 years, they've had what they call 500-year floods. So it is an extreme weather event. Some of the areas got more, as I said, more rain from Imelda than they did from Hurricane Harvey a year ago, which was just devastating to a lot of places in the Houston, Texas area, and up into Louisiana and even Mississippi. So all of these extreme weather events have caused a spike in concerns about the climate, really kind of an apocalyptic view of what's going on with what is called climate change. Now, it used to be global warming, now it's climate change. I think one of the, Rachel Maddow on MSNBC a couple years ago said, I think she was on the David Letterman show, and he said, well, what is climate change? And her answer was, I think it means extreme weather of all kinds. So in other words, they can make anything that happens they can attribute to climate change, which is under the control of man, and therefore man can solve the solution. And one of the problems with that view is a very humanistic view. It completely takes God out of the equation. And we know that God will send judgment on places through weather. But this week they had, get out of class for a day with an excused absence. You can go to the climate change rallies all over the place. So they're all over the world. Here's the New York Times and the Independent front pages, the Independent from the UK, showing all the different places where they had these student climate change protests. The Guardian called it the day that they took to the streets. And in New York City, there was a bit of a controversy. They gave the students the day off to go protest climate change, and they were going to give them an excused absence. Now, the question would be, would they give them an excused absence to go to a pro-life rally or to an anti-abortion rally? And you know the answer to that question. Now, the problem in New York City was teachers were going to take field trips, but there's a rule or statute in New York or an ordinance that does not allow them to engage in political activity during classes. So some of them had to cancel, and of course everybody was disappointed. I saw a video of this little Greta Thunberg, or whatever her name is, the 16-year-old who took a very nice yacht across the ocean from Europe to come to protest and speak at the UN. I think she'll be speaking this week during the big UN fall meetings. I've heard that there is a crew is being flown to the United States on a private jet to take the yacht back. And of course she claims that she's so sensitive and concerned about the environment. She actually testified at Congress this week. She was reading from a prepared statement. I didn't have time to grab the video clip, and essentially her thing was, I'm not going to read a prepared statement for you, as she read a prepared statement that was sitting right in front of her. And the things that I saw were just extreme everywhere. I mean, the hysterical rants about how we're all going to die, all of these things. Now, it's interesting that if somebody in church talks about a coming apocalypse, we're extremists and crazy people, but they can go talk about it and force it down the throat of kids. In some respects, I heard a lady call in, I think it was the Dennis Prager show, and she was distraught. She was crying when she called in and said that her child's undergoing psychological counseling for stress because they keep shoving this climate change and other things down her throat, and it's upsetting her child to the extent that she had to go get psychological counseling. Now, someone asked, well, should they be given an excused absence for attending these things? And I think one response to that is, actually the less time they spend in class being indoctrinated in these things might actually be a good thing. Melanie Phillips, it's back from her, I think, some time that she took off this summer, and she has some very good observations about this whole climate change thing and the fact that people are writing out the Bible out of anything to do with our culture. And she says this, I'll just quote from her recent article. Without the Hebrew Bible, there would have been no Western rationality or principles such as justice or compassion. But secularism holds that the rule of reason divorced from biblical religion would banish bad things like prejudice or war from the world and the human heart. Impossible utopianism like this invariably results in oppression. So it proved with medieval apocalyptic Christianity, the French Revolution, communism, and fascism, and so it is proving today with the cultural totalitarianism of the left. Like all utopians, the left believes their ideas are unchallengeable because they supposedly stand for virtue itself. All who oppose them are therefore not just wrong, but evil. So heretics like Gellertner, she was writing an article about David Gellertner, who I played his Uncommon Knowledge discussion with Dr. Berlinski and Stephen Meyer. talking about the collapse of Darwinism. And so Galertner, who is Jewish, but I believe secular, but has said that we really can't pay attention to Darwinism anymore because it's collapsing. It just doesn't make any sense from a mathematical probability standpoint. He's considered to be a heretic in the secular university. They have their heretics too. So heretics like Galertner, Melanie Phillips says, must be stamped out because no quarter can ever be given to any challenge to secularism. What secular liberals don't understand is that in attacking the Jewish concepts at the core of the Christian West, they are not merely repudiating their own supposed ideals of tolerance and rationality, but sawing off the branch on which they themselves are sitting. Excellent thoughts. Another thing that is, I think, related to this, here's a short video that shows that the death rates for children across the third world in particular are collapsing. Let me back this up and play it again. And so you can see there's no audio to this. So that you can see that the death rates, the darker colors are higher death rates, are going down all over the world. The areas of dark blue here represent significant decreases in the birth rate, the mortality rate of children from 2000 to 2017. And the only places that you really see that they are not collapsing is in this area here, which represents Syria. In that area, child mortality is going up. Another report was released this week called A World at Risk. The Global Preparedness Monitoring Board issued their annual report on global preparedness for health emergencies. Foreign Policy had a good article following up on it and said that the world knows an apocalyptic pandemic is coming, but nobody is interested in doing anything about it. Here's from the article on Foreign Policy, a new independent report compiled at the request of the United Nations Secretary General warns that a very real threat of a pandemic sweeping the planet, killing up to 80 million people. A deadly pathogen spread airborne around the world, the report says, could wipe out almost 5% of the global economy, and we're not ready. And here's a map of some of the different threats that exist and the death rates and how prominent they are. There's a lot of things out there, and a lot of these things are growing. This plays into some of the prophecies of Revelation that talk about deaths from pestilence. And it's a very real issue, and it's a very real concern. It's also, I think, related to the restructuring of how people live globally. Back in about 1950, people lived at about the rate of 30% lived in urban areas. That number is now up to about 55% and will rise to about 68% over the next couple of decades. Of course, when people live in closer contact with others, they have they're more likely to communicate diseases. So this is something I think entirely related to the things that we read in Revelation that are going to come about even more severely than they have thus far in the end times. Now, this week, Merriam-Webster, which is the one of the dictionaries of choice, came out and they added a non-binary pronoun they to the dictionary. And if you look at this, it says definition of they, those people, animals, or things. They dance well. Who do they want to be? It says number 2, used to refer to people in a general way or a group of people. Also could be used with an indefinite third person or singular antecedent, but they've added this definition. Used to refer to a single person whose gender identity is non-binary. So here what we see is that for example, here's a comment, example of how it would be used, the paragraph at the bottom. I knew certain things about the person I was interviewing. They had adopted their gender-neutral name a few years ago when they began to consciously identify as non-binary, that is, neither male nor female. They were in their late 20s working as an event planner, applying to graduate school. This is a quote from an article. And this is one of these things that we should expect to see in the end times. We know that the son of perdition, commonly shortened down to the Antichrist, it's one of the descriptions of him is that he will seek to change laws and times and seasons. And I think this is one of the example is here they are changing the language with something that's not based on science, it's based on feelings. So I just have a suggestion I thought about this a little bit, that maybe Merriam-Webster needs to sort of update other parts of their dictionary. So I thought that if they're going to change they to refer to a singular person that's non-binary, then perhaps they need to update their definition of sellout, which would be, and I had something very clever drafted, and now I see that I didn't include it. So what I've suggested that they add a fifth definition down, synonym, Merriam-Webster selling out to the cultural police and the leftists that want to change language and do something that is totally unscientific. I also noticed there was an article this week by a New York Times columnist who was talking about a cultural issue. And so I looked up, he had an op-ed, the subject is not important, but I looked up the bio that they have on the New York Times website for this gentleman. His name is Farhad Manjoo. He's been a New York Times opinion columnist since last year. And in his biograph, in the second paragraph, you can see it says here, before that, they wrote the Times State of the Art column covering the technology industry's efforts to swallow up the world. They have also written for Slate. Farhad Manjoo was born in South Africa and immigrated with their family to Southern California in the late 1980s. They live in Northern California with their wife and 2 children. I guess pray for him and pray for these kids. He actually wrote a column at the New York Times called It's Time for They. The singular they is inclusive and flexible, and it breaks the stifling prison of gender expectations. Let's all use it. And so this passes muster for the New York Times opinion columnist. The man there with a mustache and beard wants to be referred to as a non-binary they. Now this is being pushed on all levels. So I'm going to play a short video by an organization that is pushing, these are being used in some schools and classrooms. I believe this one is from middle school or high school in sex education, health or sex education classes. This is called Love is Love, Free to Be Me. Watch just a couple minutes of this is what they're teaching.
I felt totally alone before, like I was invisible. And nobody could see me. I finally talked to a friend. I told her I like boys, that I think I'm gay. She said, that's cool, as long as you're happy. You can be attracted to whoever you want. Just telling her made me feel better. I felt so relieved.
I felt so lost and alone before. I decided to tell my aunt what had been bothering me. Of course I was nervous. told her that I like girls, that I think I'm a lesbian. She said, "Thank you for telling me. I'm so happy you confided in me. I just want you to be happy and healthy and know that I will always be proud of you." After telling her, I felt so much better. Like a huge weight had been lifted.
People would always ask me, "Do you like boys or girls?" As if I could only be attracted to one. You don't have to just like boys or just like girls. Being bisexual means you can be attracted to boys and girls. Sometimes it's not easy for others to accept you for who you are or who you are attracted to.
There are lots of sexual orientations you can have. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual, or something else. They're all okay.
So I apologize for that if it was offensive, but I ran it by a group that I belong to on Facebook, and they said it would be okay to play it, so I'll blame them in case people are upset. But listen, this is what's being shoved down the throats of children everywhere. Another thing that I found this week, this is a toolkit that has been issued, a toolkit for Native youth to build inclusion by the Western States Center. You might be surprised to learn that this is a left-wing organization, but it's called Indigenizing Love. I hesitate to play the video that accompanied this, but what it talks about is providing a toolkit for people to become what they call in the Native American community Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA plus people. This document contains content and discussions that may be new to readers. In this toolkit, we cover discussions on gender transphobia and homophobia. Some of this content may cause you anxiety, confusion, or trigger unwanted memories. We encourage you to engage in this content to the extent that you feel comfortable and where necessary, disengage from the conversation. But this is, the examples that I could use each week are legion. Now, they mention in their transphobia, I think I may have mentioned this briefly last week. This is a publication, a report put out by Tony Blair, an organization that he was running called Designating Hate, New Policy Responses to Stop Hate Crime. And what they say is that we need to come up with a better definition of hate because we have to, especially in the area of religion. It's easy when it's racial or something else, but essentially the import of the report is religious people get a pass on hate. They should never be against anything, except unless you're against religion, and that's okay. Another thing that's being pushed on many levels, is the concept of globalism, global religion, humanism, and that sort of thing. I mentioned a number of times that the Pope went to the United Arab Emirates back in February and signed a pact with the chief theologian of Al-Azhar University from Cairo, the largest Sunni Islamic institution on the planet, maybe the most important one, about how they were going to promote this one global religion. We're all going to get along in religion. And this is being pushed on many levels. The Pope is following it up this week. He came out with a thing called Amazonia, New Paths for the Church in an Integral Ecology, preparatory document of the Synod of Bishops for the Special Assembly for the Pan-American region. And so you see the sort of the melding of humanism, religion, globalism, and everything in one document. And then on the right of that slide, you see that they are going to have May 14th, 2020, they're inviting everybody to the Vatican for a Reinventing the Global Educational Alliance, where the Pope is going to be pushing his globalist agenda. And he's, as we've noted many times, he's a leftist more than he is anything else. So one of the things that we see happening, we see We see weather issues, we see, and they always are using the term unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this before. This happens regularly. It's sort of diminishing the use of the term unprecedented because there's so many unprecedented things that are happening. We see a rise of globalism. We see a change in sexual mores that's being pushed on children. I could do an hour or two each week just on the things that I see each week that are happening there. We see this push for climate change, and that's leading to this globalism as well. So now I want to take a turn to the Middle East and talk about some of the things that happened there. Now, on Monday, September 9th, this is about almost 2 weeks ago now, Nasrallah came out with a speech that he gave to his followers. And in this speech, remember now, this is coming on the heels of Hezbollah taking out a vehicle in northern Israel, Israel responding. We also had the drones that hit a factory. We also had some bombing that took place by Israel in the Bekaa Valley of a plant that was being set up to mix chemicals to allow better fueling, better efficiency for the rockets, or better capabilities of the rockets. So in his speech, Nasrallah referred to Israel as a Hollywood army, and he challenged Israel's military to perform more Hollywood shows. You are a Hollywood army, and we have learned a lesson from the show you perform. Nasrallah said in a speech to mark the Muslim holiday of Ashura. In future responses, instead of hitting one vehicle, we will hit more. Instead of hitting one target, we will hit more. And let's see how many Hollywood shows you can perform. Lebanon respects the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which deals with activity in southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah is part of the government that respects this resolution, but if Israel attacks, there will be no red lines at all, he warned. Any war in Iran will ignite the region and destroy countries and people, he said. It will be a war against the entire axis of resistance. We will not be neutral in this battle between right and wrong. This war will be the end of Israel and the American hegemony and presence in the region. Nasrallah also said that the group and its allies, including Iran, were in the middle of a major campaign. Now, that was a week ago, Monday, 2 weeks ago tomorrow. We know that last Sunday morning, an attack was launched on oil installations, 2 refineries in Saudi Arabia. There's been a lot of controversy as to where it occurred. This picture, while this was taken on September 15th, I saw an update, and these are in a line. These are a part of a pipeline. And it's believed that these are, because of the damage that was occurred at the refinery, they can't move as much oil into the refinery, and therefore they're having to burn it off. And so these are essentially relief wells where they burn off the excess gas and oil that they can't get to the refinery. And these are still burning as I speak this morning on Sunday. This is a picture of the attack. These are some things that we did not have access to last Sunday. And this is a major one of the oil installations. There were 2 that were attacked. This one is the largest oil processing plant facility on planet Earth. It, because it's been shut down, it has an impact that it sort of immediately takes about 5% of the world's oil offline. This is a very major deal, and I want to spend a little time on it because of the geopolitics involved, and I think because a lot of these countries are involved as players in the end times, and I think this is very important. Saudi is, now, this kind of comes right on the cusp of Saudi coming out with an initial public offering to sell a stake, shares in Aramco. Aramco is a Saudi government-owned oil company. It controls all the oil in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is, in many respects, Aramco, and Aramco is Saudi Arabia. It's effectively their largest company. It had over $100 billion in profits last year. And Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been pushing this to raise money because because of the way Saudi government is and society is structured, they're in a cash crunch and they need to raise some money. Now, the thinking was that the IPO would come out and Saudi Arabia Aramco would be valued at $2 trillion. The initial attempt to go public with the offering really only raised about $50 billion, so it was withdrawn. So now they're coming back out. This is the third attempt that they're going to make to do this. They're, again, expecting to raise $1 trillion. Because of the way Saudi Arabia is, everybody is effectively employed by Aramco or something related to Aramco. It's hard to divide Saudi government from Aramco and Aramco from the Saudi government and what people do for a living. So everybody gets some money. And this is a problem with the way the Saudi royal family has repopulated itself or populated itself over the years. King Saud, who really started his campaigns and started taking over territory about 100 years ago, had multiple wives. I've heard as many as 60 plus. He had dozens and dozens and dozens of children. A lot of them have multiple wives, and they've had lots of children. So the Saudi family, royal family itself, is now in the thousands of people, and they live in some respects, very profligate, luxurious, expensive lifestyles. But the population in Saudi Arabia is aging as well. They have a retirement age of 55. So because of that, Saudi Arabia is running a budget deficit for the first time ever. It's in around $12 or $15 billion now. And this has a big impact because the Saudi, many years ago, the United States and Saudi Arabia entered into an agreement. We would protect their facilities, we would buy their oil or allow them to sell their oil if they would price the oil in dollars. Now, that created the petrodollar, which is the world's reserve currency, and that has some good impact for the United States. When Britain, the UK the British pound was no longer the world reserve currency. It had an economic impact in the United Kingdom and the British Empire. So having the dollar as the reserve currency for the last, getting on to about 50 years, has been beneficial to the United States, but there are a lot of people that want to change it. Part of the reason for this attack may be that they want to change that. China would like to change it, Russia, Iran. Many countries would like to get off of the dollar. Somewhere in the order of 99% of international bank settlements are done in dollars. Now, if that was done in something else, it would have an economic impact on the United States. So people want to damage the United States, and they do this. But as you can see from these images, there were about 17 points of attack on these oil refineries in Saudi Arabia. They hit very key components of these refineries to the extent that 17 points of contact, 18 missiles. I think the Houthis said there were 10 that they shot, or 10 drones. These crippled a large portion of Saudi Arabian oil production, cut it in almost in half just with one attack with, I won't call them simple missiles, but they were, they got a lot of bang for their buck, whoever did the attack. Now, on the heels of this attack, there's been a lot of controversy. Who did it? Was it the Houthis who claimed responsibility? The United States government, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have said that it's Iran. The President Trump has been a little bit less direct in who he's accused of doing it. The Saudis say it was Iran. I believe I mentioned to you last Sunday, I saw a video from someone in Kuwait who was showing missiles, what look like missiles, the glowing engine of a missile flying over Kuwait from the north to the south not too long before these refineries, the explosions started occurring. At the same time this is going on, we still have a major problem in Syria, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But, we always talk about the Ezekiel 38, 39 alliance, and there's three major players, I believe, in connection with that, and that would be Russia, Turkey, and Iran, or Persia. They met this week in Ankara. It was their fifth meeting that they've put together to meet and discuss things. They have a process that they've been going through called the Astana process. Astana is a city in Kazakhstan, I believe it's Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. It's now been named after the former president, but they still call this the Astana process. And the Astana process is being run by Turkey, Russia, and Iran. And they rotate where they're meeting. They're going to meet again in Tehran in about a month. And they had a meeting. This is the fifth meeting that they've had. And main thing was to work out issues that have developed between what Russia wants to accomplish in Syria, what Iran wants to accomplish in Syria, and what Turkey wants to accomplish in Syria. And those desires and goals do not mesh up very well. Iran wants to build the last part of its land bridge all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean. Turkey wants to extend its influence down into Syria. Russia, of course, wants to look like it's the great global peacemaker and be able to solve the world problems. And also it gets an air base or two and a warm water port at Latakia. So they've had these meetings. Syria continues to be extremely divided. When you get up into the northern region, the Idlib province up here, this is Aleppo. This blue area is the area that Turkey has moved to extend its reach down into Afrin. The red areas are those controlled by the Syrian regime. The green areas are controlled by rebels. So there is this last spot here to control the Syrian regime effectively. This area here in the south of Syria is largely unpopulated, although ISIS is making a comeback in that particular area. And Idlib here, they've been bombing that quite a bit, the Syrian regime in Russia, to drive people out. It's driving more refugees up into this area, into Syria. Syria is trying to stop that. Syria is also threatening to release the 3.5 million refugees that it currently has, many of whom live in Istanbul. And that influx of 3.5 million refugees into a country with a population of 80 million has had a huge destabilizing impact. So Turkey and the U.S. are trying to do along the border here, the Syrian border. Syria wants a safe zone. The U.S. says they'll work with Turkey. Turkey says the United States isn't doing enough. We want them out. Everybody wants the United States out. So Turkey would like this, frankly, Turkey would like this safe zone to extend all the way down to Dar az-Zor and Mosul and take this area over, because this area, the yellowish area, orange area, is controlled by the Kurds, and Turkey and the Kurds are very much at loggerheads, at least on a number of levels. So Turkey would like to get this area under its control. This is the Euphrates River that flows down through, and there's also the Tigris River. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So this is an editorial from the Daily Sabah. This is a publication that's controlled by Erdogan and the Turkish government. So you're going to read almost pro-Erdogan propaganda and opinions in this particular publication. So they have diverging priorities. Putin did talk at the meeting, and here's just a couple minutes of Putin, and he's talking, and he's going to address first the sort of the general process, then he's going to talk about what he hopes to, or a solution he has for the attack on Saudi Arabia.
This is our fifth meeting as the guarantors of the Astana process and the Syrian settlement. Russia, Turkey, and Iran are ready to facilitate that in every part of Syria. We should let the Syrians themselves decide how to solve these problems which have emerged in the last 80 years.
It should be 8 years.
As for the drone attack on Saudi's oil refinery facilities, we did not discuss that, but you're aware what kind of position we have. In Yemen, there is a huge humanitarian crisis, a catastrophe. The situation can be called catastrophe by all means, and we are ready to help people, and we call upon every stakeholder to follow suit and reach out to these people in need. Second, we believe that the best way to solve the crisis would be to find agreement between every side involved in the conflict. And since we are here in Turkey, in the country where the Muslim majority is clear, I cannot but remember the words of the Quran. Remember about the grace of Allah. You used to be enemies, but Allah helped you to become friends and to forget about all your differences. So that is what you should remember. You became brothers thanks to His grace. That's how it reads. So things which drive people away should give in to the spiritual proximity, to the proximity of hearts of people. As for Saudi Arabia, the very same sacred book of Quran says that any kind of violence is unacceptable, except for one kind of violence, when you protect your people. We are ready to protect the people. We are ready to help Saudi Arabia to protect their people. And they need to make one clever decision, as Iran did, buying our S-300, and as Mr. Erdogan did by deciding to buy the most advanced S-400 Triumph air defense systems from Russia. These kind of systems are capable of defending any kind of infrastructure in Saudi Arabia from any kind of attack.
So Mr. Putin not only is an expert theologian in Islamic theology, but he is also a bit of a stand-up comedian. Saudi Arabia wants to be protected. They should just buy weapons from us and everything will be okay. They'll be able to protect their facilities. I'm going to play a video. We've talked about hypersonic missiles that Russia's developing. I want to give you an idea as to how fast these goes. This is a video. It's going to be played at full speed, then half speed, then quarter speed. This was done in the hypersonic testing facility out at Edwards Air Force Base in California, but it will give you some idea what kind of threat these weapons are. So here is a sled that's set up on a track at hypersonic speeds. I think this one goes around 6,000 miles per hour. And I just want you to see what the light that you see in the distance is a mile away. So here's a test. This is at full speed. Okay, did you see that come by? Okay, here we're going to do it at half speed. Maybe this will be a little bit better. You'll be able to see everything. I'm sure the details of this hypersonic device. Not quite. Well, let's try it at a quarter speed and see if you see it any better. Here comes, and the quarter speed, of course, is not really anything that you can see. Now, Syria is a mess. This is a report that was put out by the Syrian Network for Human Rights. They have a lot of, you can download it from the internet. You can see that the cities all throughout, particularly up in the Idlib region, This is mainly focused on the city of Khan Shaykhun, city I talked about a couple weeks ago, and the destruction that has taken place there. It's just, and what they're doing is they bomb the houses and people have to leave. They have to go someplace else. At the same time this is going on, this is a island that was attacked by U.S. forces with, I'm thinking it was like 40 tons of munitions attacking an island that was occupied by ISIS. And you can kind of get an idea of what 40 tons of bombs and munitions will do. Essentially what they did was they carpet bombed it. So this is modern warfare. This is the type of thing that you can do. Now, the other thing that Turkey's doing in this region is they're filling up a dam on the Tigris River. And this is dams and water has been a strategy of Turkey for quite some time. So they're filling up this dam. People are concerned downriver that they're not going to have water, that things are going to become difficult. And Turkey has a lot of water. They don't have oil and gas, but they have a lot of water. There was a famous, I believe it was a predecessor of Erdogan, when this issue came up, the Iranians were bragging about how much oil they had, and the Turkish leader was quoted as saying, well, you drink your oil and we'll drink our water, and we'll see who survives longer. So this is in Turkey setting up these dams to control how the Kurds move. Turkey is also involved with Qatar. I would recommend Jonathan Spires' article in the Friday Jerusalem Post about the relationship between Qatar and Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood. This is another thing, and what they're doing is they're trying to influence society, social structures down at the lower level to build their base. This is exactly what Iran has done throughout Syria and Iraq and is doing to make it very difficult to, even if you uprooted the government, you would still have this structure in place. It's a very clever way to do this. These are some of the pictures of the drones or cruise missiles that attacked. The Saudi foreign minister came out. He had this to say about Iran.
Engagement you have with Iran, the more Iran believes that its aggressive behavior is acceptable in the world, and that's not acceptable. So those issues have to be reconsidered. We are in consultations with our allies and friends with regards to the next steps that we need to take. We are awaiting the final results of the investigation with regards to the attack, and in particular where it originated from, so that we can build a response on that.
And then in response to that, commander of the Iran's Revolutionary Guard commander said this: any country that will attack us will become the battlefield. And he gave this speech at the Museum of Islamic Revolution and Sacred Defense during the opening of an exhibition of what Iran says are American drones and others shot down on its territory. He said that any country attacking Iran would be the main battlefield. I think this is a threat to release terrorist cells that they have put in place around the world. Anyone who wants his land to become the main battlefield should go on. We will never allow any war to be dragged onto Iranian territory. We hope they will not make a strategic mistake. Seth Bransman has a good analysis of this at this morning's Jerusalem Post about Iran, and he talks about the fact that the message from Tehran and these responses to threats that they're going to be attacked is threefold. The overall message from Tehran is threefold, Seth writes. We can strike everywhere in the region. We will respond aggressively throughout the region to any attacks on us, and we have already downed your drones. We have the technology to do worse. And I'll show you a report here in just a moment that talks about this. This is an article that Seth wrote in National Review on the same thing. The attack on Saudi Arabia is the crisis Iran was waiting for. He says this: Tehran would have known that an unprecedented attack on key Saudi Arabian oil facilities by so many drones would raise eyebrows about claims that the poor and isolated Houthi rebels were behind it. The attack sends a clear message: this can get worse. End the sanctions and don't risk the world's oil supply. Iran thinks that Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies won't risk a conflict, and the Iranians think They called the Trump administration's bluff in June when they shot down our couple $100 million drone, and we didn't really respond, other than with more economic sanctions. September 14 was a gamble, but also a clear message felt across the Middle East. The era of Iran's sophisticated precision-guided drone and cruise missile attacks is here. So Saudi says they're going to bring their oil production back in a few weeks. A lot of articles, foreign policy, that this is the moment that decides the Middle East. The Treasury Department came out with very severe sanctions on Iran's central bank, essentially cutting them off. So this is a big deal. Anthony Cordesman, who writes at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, came out with a couple of reports this week. First was the strategic implications of the strikes on Saudi Arabia, noting that it wasn't a massive air attack or anything like that. It was a couple dozen drones or cruise missiles. They were able to cripple a large portion of the Saudi Arabian oil production. And there was no response to it. So the thinking is that they could do this. And he has a lot of conclusions, but he just says this: how far is the U.S. willing to risk involvement in a major new war with new forces that needed to be armed? What new forces will be needed to arm U.S. forces or deter and defend and equip our strategic partners? And he concludes with this: the seriousness of all the questions is now all too obvious. The answers are not. And so people are, I think, struggling a bit for some answers as to how we're going to respond to this. He also came out with a report this week, Dr. Cordesman, saying Iran, Yemen, and the strikes on Saudi Arabia. Now, this was written early in the week before some of the evidence linking it more to Iran came out. But he has this. This is very interesting because of the change in strategy that this is causing. And if you take what's happening here and transfer it over to Iran's desire to get rid of Israel as a nation, there's a direct connection that you should be watching. And he says this, Dr. Cordesman: the history of warfare has never been filled with good predictions of how warfare would evolve in the future. Aside from the odd science fiction writer, no one predicted the technical, tactical, and strategic nature of World War I. World War II began with gross exaggerations of the threat posed by opposing gas in the air forces of the day. Navies that still emphasized battleships in a war that became dominated by submarines and carriers. The uncertain efforts to reshape land forces evolved into blitzkrieg after armored offensives that initially involved German field commanders that disobeyed order from the high command. And so this is a constant problem, is how do we deal with some of the things that are coming in modern warfare? He also says that, look, this asymmetric, unusual warfare, new developments, technologies, is spreading from places like North Korea, supported by China, and to some extent Russia, and Iran gaining the technology from North Korea, and everybody pushing the envelope and continuing to move it further. And he just says this: it is all too clear from the confusing babble of the analysis of the Saudi strikes, however, that Iran has made major progress, and there are strong hints that China and North Korea have or will soon acquire such capabilities. The broader deployment of truly advanced UCAVs and cruise missiles is simply a matter of time at best, and the time frame for major deployment is unlikely to exceed 3 to 5 years at most, particularly given the success of the recent strikes on Saudi Arabia. As the strikes on Saudi Arabia have shown, the target also does not have to be military. It can be a key energy facility where civilians are normally present. It could be a key link in a national communication system, and a power grid, a stock exchange, a water purification or critical urban sanitary facility, or a stress point on a bridge. And it's talked about the hybrid and gray area warfare that's developing here. Even truly serious attacks can be ambiguous or have some degree of deniability. So this is a big problem, and this is, I think, an excellent thing. It talks about naval warfare is changing because of the development of hypersonic missiles, and you saw an example of that. He says this: as Iran may well have already demonstrated, cruise missiles and UCAVs can also be used to to counter or supplement economic warfare and deal with sanctions. They reinforce the fact that the ability to escalate in some military ways is not producing some new form of mutually assured destruction, but is integrating political, economic, and military warfare. And he concludes, seen from a broader perspective, they are warning that the only rules to future warfare are those that are no rules, and that the only fully predictable aspect of the future of warfare is that it will be at least as unpredictable in the past. Excellent publication. It's about 7 or 8 pages if you want to download and read that from CSIS. He was the one who wrote an analysis of a potential war back in 2007, nuclear war between Iran and Israel. I won't go into that in detail. I will say that one of the things he talked about, which I think sort of relates to Bible prophecy, and I'm sure he's not aware of that, was a strike on the city of Damascus. And this is actually a graphic from his report in 2007. Let me take just a few minutes to look at the Israeli elections. It appears, this is from one of the Arab newspapers, that Netanyahu may be on his way out. Almost all the votes have now been counted. The results of the election appear to be this. Likud, that's Netanyahu's party, got 31 Knesset seats. Now, nobody's being elected prime minister. The prime minister is a member of Knesset, and he is selected by everybody he forms the government by getting a majority of the Knesset members to support him. Blue and White, headed by Danny Gantz, is got 33, and then Lieberman's party, Yisrael Benyatanu, got 8. And I only show him because he's he's sort of being viewed as the kingmaker, because when you divide it down between left and right, you have 55, 57, you need 61, so it appears that Lieberman can control. And so there's all these negotiations going on. President Rivlin will have the responsibility of trying to lead those negotiations. There's a lot of opinions as to how this should go. For example, here's an opinion from the Daily Sabah. Israel's illegal settlement policy was a key factor in the elections. Some people said that it was Prime Minister Netanyahu's claim that they're going to annex parts of the Jordan Valley. I want to play a couple-minute clip of Caroline Glick on Secure Freedom Radio the other day, I think explaining in pretty good detail how things may go.
So, Carolyn, if the Likud party under Benjamin Netanyahu can't form a coalition either, does that mean that Israel will go back to the third round of elections in the space of 6 months or so? Or is there some other way ahead as you see it?
That is a possibility. There is another possibility. There are 2 other possibilities. What Netanyahu did immediately after the election is that he took all the splinter parties and he unified them with Likud, and they signed an agreement that they would all negotiate as a bloc of 55, and that they wouldn't enter any government as separate parties. They would only enter as a bloc. The minute that he did that, he essentially ensured that all things being equal, he'll form the next government, because eventually, over the next 6 weeks, when the government is supposed to be formed, the greater likelihood is that either Blue and White will splinter. Blue and White itself is a consortium of 3 separate parties, so it's possible that one of them will break off. And if they begin to splinter, then the most likely scenario under that condition is that the left-wing Labor Party, which is now just a small party, the party that used to be the governing party of Israel for Israel's first 31 years, now only has 6 seats, but that's sufficient to form a majority coalition with the right-wing bloc. So I think at the end of the day, it's possible that they're just going to form a government with Likud. Likud will give them whatever ministerial positions they demand, and they will form a stable governing coalition under Netanyahu. I think that's most likely. People say, well, Netanyahu is going to be indicted in a month or so, and therefore he's going to have to step down. But that's not true either. That's sort of a mischaracterization. It's true that he's being subjected to criminal probes much along the lines of the Russia collusion probe that Trump has been subjected to for the past 2 years. But the wheels of injustice also move very slowly in Israel. So I think that this is going to drag on much longer than the commentators on the left would like.
So that's her assessment. I think it's a pretty accurate assessment. But there's a lot of anti-Netanyahu feeling. What she was saying is on the left, the blue and white party is actually a coalition of three parties, of which Labor, the former Labor Party, has 6 seats. So those 6 seats could leave the left and move over to the right and give Netanyahu 61 seats. That would effectively cut out Lieberman. Lieberman wants a unity party of those 2 major parties, and he doesn't want to have any coalition with the ultra-Orthodox and religious parties. So if you think our politics is a mess, but this is having an impact, and I would recommend Caroline's article on Israel Halem. You can find the English version on her Facebook page or Twitter account about how this is having severe strategic implications for how Israel responds to things in the future, such as this. There was some troop movements and that type of thing near Kenitra on the Golan Heights. They found a drone. Israel says it's an Iranian drone. The Syrians say it's an Israeli drone. And so this continues to be a very volatile region that we should look like. So I'm going to be doing an interview in about an hour or so, with a couple hours with Olivier Melnick of Chosen People Ministries, but we wanted to put this up. And remember that when we talk about multi-level warfare, the things that we see going on culturally with what they're doing to the children and the agendas that they're pushing, this is a spiritual warfare on many levels. I would appreciate prayer for a couple of friends of mine who are under very intense spiritual attack, to the point where one of them told me recently that they believe there's a possibility they may not survive it. It's that intense. And Ephesians says this, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. And I would add that there's a passage in Hebrews that says that we should not, as we see the day approaching, we should not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. We need to be very united as a church, as a remnant church, as a faithful remnant church, looking forward to the coming of the Lord. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you will watch over us this day, bless our services today. Pray you will give great power and wisdom to the things that are spoken, and that people, in understanding for those that hear, bless us this day. In Jesus' name, amen.